Hello, my name is Danny Fitzpatrick. Of those philosophers who have maintained an authentic Catholicism while making original contributions to philosophy in such a way as to engage the philosophical community and the culture at large, Jacques Maritain is perhaps the premier example from the last century. Over the span of a life of prolonged contact with figures as diverse as Charles de Gaulle, painter Georges Rouault, and American poet Alan Tate, of immense philosophical activity with contributions to metaphysics, epistemology, political philosophy, the philosophy of nature, and aesthetics, and of constant striving after holiness in the mystical tradition, Maritain provided an example of the way in which authentic scholarship may both help to guide the course of history and conduce to the salvation of the soul. Thus, St. John Paul II lifts him up in Fides et Ratio 74 as an exemplar of the relation between faith and reason. Here we aim to provide a brief account of Maritain's biography, with emphasis on his spiritual journey, his major works, several of the chief ideas which engaged his attention over the course of his career, and of his contribution to aesthetics. Maritain was born in Paris, November 18, 1882. As a young man, he studied philosophy and natural sciences at the Sorbonne, where he inclined at first to the thinking of Spinoza, whose panentheistic mathematical conception of the universe, in the memorable and troubling phrase, Deus sive natura, God or nature, seems indeed to go a long way down the path suggested by Descartes toward philosophizing only in terms of things which admit of mathematical precision. Maritain met Raisa Umansov, also at the Sorbonne, in 1901. A Russian Jew, she shared Maritain's sense of the spiritual bankruptcy current in France at the turn of the century. The two made a pact that if they had not found meaning in life within a year, they would together commit suicide. Fortunately, through the influence of poet Charles Péguy and philosopher Henri Bergson, the two began to see a way out of the mire. They were married in 1904 and baptized Catholic in 1906, again through the influence of the arts, this time in the person of Léon Blois. Maritain continued his studies in natural science and around 1908 dove into the works of St. Thomas Aquinas. He subsequently lectured in Europe and throughout North and South America. The Maritains moved to New York in 1940 and remained there until 1944, when France was liberated and Maritain became French ambassador to the Vatican, as well as part of the French representation at UNESCO. The Maritains returned to the US in 1948. Jacques taught at Princeton. In 1959, the couple moved once more to France. Raisa died in November 1960, after which Jacques retired to the community of the Little Brothers of Jesus in Toulouse, where he died on April 28, 1973. Maritain wrote extensively on a great many topics. His most significant contributions were in metaphysics, for example in his works A Preface to Metaphysics, 7 lectures on being, Existence and the Existent, and From Bergson to Thomas, essays on metaphysics and morals, as well as epistemology, where his key work was perhaps Distinguish to Unite, or The Degrees of Knowledge, as well as The Range of Reason, philosophy of nature, including Introduction to Philosophy and the Philosophy of Nature, philosophy of religion, including Approaches to God, political philosophy, including the natural law, man and the state, and the rights of man, and aesthetics, including art and scholasticism, the frontiers of poetry, and the responsibility of the artist. The mere list of works here, which names but a few of Maritain's titles, indicates the broad scope of Maritain's interests. In him we see a return to the way of doing philosophy which characterized men like Aristotle, Plato, and St. Thomas. That is, a profound interest in all that is, and a firm faith in man's capacity to explore what is as a key facet of attaining his own end. While Maritain's work may broadly be understood as Thomistic in character, one of his chief roles was to renovate St. Thomas's thought in light of the rapidly changing landscape of 20th century political, philosophical, and artistic life. We'll look now at several of Maritain's philosophical preoccupations. He was, of course, eminently interested in metaphysics. Maritain understands being as hierarchical, with the mind capable of interfacing with that hierarchy according to the intelligibility of the thing to be known. The profoundly mysterious, because supra-intelligible, being as being, must be the underlying concern of all other philosophical inquiry. Thus, says Maritain, quote, "A philosopher is not a philosopher unless he is a metaphysician," end quote. To be a metaphysician, however, requires what Maritain calls the intuition of being, which goes beyond the general sense that there are, of course, things around us, but extends to, quote, "a very simple sight, superior to any discursive reasoning or demonstration, of a reality which it touches and which takes hold of it." That is, to be a metaphysician is to become aware of being inasmuch as intellect is privileged to encounter it, a being which itself seizes the intellect and so makes the self properly aware of itself. Likewise, Maritain had a deep and abiding interest in epistemology. Right? Here he saw a hierarchy of knowledge corresponding to the hierarchy of being. Right? In all of this, we're struck with Maritain's extraordinary gift of attention, of attending in a sustained way to what is. Such attention may, at least in part, suffice to explain many of his other philosophical preoccupations. In the area of epistemology, for instance, he reminds us of Aristotle's dictum that it is the mark of wisdom to seek only such accuracy as our subject admits. And yet this does not issue in any kind of epistemological laziness. Rather, he says that the mind is not satisfied when it merely attains a thing, but only when it grasps that upon which that datum is founded in being and intelligibility. And this in turn goes back to his metaphysical preoccupation with the intuition of being. In the philosophy of nature, Maritain was concerned to inquire after a proper understanding of the limitations of science. He says it belongs to the philosophy of nature to instruct us about the nature of the continuum and of number, of quantity, of space, of motion, of time, of corporeal substance, of transitive action, of vegetative and sensitive life, of the soul and its operative powers, etc. We can see in these concerns a similarity to Aristotle, both in terms of Aristotle's categories, which are concerned with things like quantity, quality, number, etc., as well as a concern with the soul, which is, of course, of preeminent importance in Aristotle's philosophy. Likewise, Maritain was very concerned with the philosophy of religion. He was profoundly convinced that man, through reason, could become fairly positive about the existence of God. In reflecting on Aquinas' traditional 5 ways of proving God's existence, he provided also a 6th way of proving this existence. He gives us this basic idea. When we reflect upon our being, though we know that we were born and that we will die, we nonetheless have a sense that we can't imagine ourselves ever not to have existed or ever not to exist in the future. Where does this idea come from? He says, "For indeed it comes from nothing in experience. Everything that we see comes to be and passes away." If this idea is not out there in the things around me, then he suggests that we must have some form of pre-existence eternally in the mind of God. And he proposes this as a 6th way of proving God's existence. Likewise, Maritain was deeply interested in political philosophy. Here he focused heavily on natural law as proceeding from an understanding of the ends of beings, and thus being able to say properly how each thing relates to the rest of reality and how each thing should operate and should in turn be treated by other beings around it. Lastly, Maritain was deeply interested in aesthetics and philosophy of art. He gives us many great works on this topic, and he looks especially to the schoolmen, the scholastics, for a way of examining the great wealth of art that was around him in the 20th century. We see, for example, a painting in the background by Georges Rouault, one of Maritain's good friends. He's especially interested in art as a habitus, right, which he's careful to say is more than just a habit which exists mechanically in the nerve centers, but is a way of making or doing in accordance with excellence, a kind of supernatural gift which extends to the person and makes one a great man. Maritain's philosophy may perhaps above all be characterized by a profound attention to being, an attention which, placing the philosopher in correct relation to all the cosmos and the God who creates it, allows him to philosophize fruitfully. This, to invert the phrase from Tertullian, is perhaps what Athens has to do with Jerusalem. We leave off with a brief note on Maritain's seminal work, Art and Scholasticism, which may in some ways be taken as typical of his method of returning to the works of the ancients and the medievals, and of renovating those works in light of recent developments in philosophy. Maritain points out in the first place that the schoolmen did not, contrary to the policy of many philosophers since at least the time of Kant, elaborate a distinct theory of aesthetics. Rather, they frequently commented on art in their discussions of logic and ethics. Taking such diverse comments and aligning them with the ancient theories of the beautiful, which the schoolmen generally perhaps held but did not explicitly comment on, Maritain delivers a robust outline for dealing with art, morality, and Christianity, a most salutary constellation in an age which celebrates not so much art as displaced identity, which dispenses with morality as contrary to art and to true human flourishing, and which would at last finally shake off Christianity. He supplies us with a sound rule for the artist and for the one who would enjoy art. He says, quote, "The artist must be as objective as the man of science, in the sense that he must think of the spectator only in order to present him with the beautiful or the well-made, just as the man of science thinks of his listener only in order to present him with the true." In elaborating his aesthetic principles, Maritain proceeded in large part from his relationships with artists, including his wife Raissa, who was a poet, and his friends Georges Rouault and Léon Blois. In turn, he played a major role in shaping the world of American letters, with Flannery O'Connor, Carolyn Gordon, and Alan Tate, for whom Maritain eventually served as godfather when Tate converted to Catholicism, among those most profoundly influenced by the philosopher. Here we have a brief bibliographical list of Maritain's works, as well as the entry on Maritain from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Thanks very much for joining me, and hopefully we can all engage more deeply with Maritain.